Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for that introduction, Connor. That's great. As you said, the subject and object of my book is towns and town plans in Ireland, really exploring their originality and their potential and rigorous layouts so they can be understood as part of not just local, but actually world culture. And the two themes of the conference, both regeneration and creating positive spaces. I think we already have positive spaces. They just need a new vision. And it's not really about adding to the edges. It's about using what we already have. So the book that I've recently published is the linking piece of research that connects everything together. And what it's really saying is, in the end, that there is a tradition of building towns in this country. It's important in the canon of art and architecture. It has a particular sphere character, which is really unique in its level of formality. And that really derives from its geography and its history. And it's really important for us to use these places now to take them into the future positively. So I'm going to show a few slides, and this first one is just to kind of give you an overall view of the scope of the book. This is a photograph of Templemore. It's from the cover of the book. It's an amazing photograph, which is taken in the 1950s. And you look at this and you just say, wow, that's an extraordinary place. Where is it and what is it? And it is our Templemore. And yet we really completely take spaces like this for granted as we drive through them. We haven't really negotiated a language to celebrate the formality that they have. And I suppose I'd be saying in this book, why is this important? And the reason it's important is because actually there's no legislative protection for the spaces themselves, in themselves. Certain buildings are picked out as protected structures, but the space itself isn't. And when I first began this research, I was really struck by the astonishing uniformity of character of so many towns in Ireland. And I kind of got to the point of deciding that they were based, kind of captured by the First Ordnance Survey map and the Lawrence collection of photographs. And they really just preserve in aspic a kind of a whole vanished society of towns at their absolute best. A fantastic way of inhabiting lovely spatial containers full of market carts and fair days and trees. So that was a starting point for me for trying to bring to the fore the formality of this planned out entities. So what I'm trying to do is to set the scene, if you like, for a new generation of people to inhabit these spaces in a good way, in new ways, but taking on what's important about what's there. So in the book, chronology sets the context, typology examines the form, and urban print of towns from the same period are put together using a figure ground abstraction that I've done myself based on the First Ordnance Survey. And then that's linked through with historic maps, which are always a fiction, always political. They capture moments of representation, what the maker of the map thought was important to convey. And then the last kind of thing is 1950s photographs, aerial photographs like this one of Templemore, which catch the towns before suburban development blunted that really sharp distinction between urban and rural landscapes. Next slide, please. Can I have the next slide? Thank you. Thanks. This is the Lawrence image of Clonmel, which epitomizes that kind of small town life. And in a funny way, I think I personally caught the end of this world when I grew up in Bray in the 1960s. And, you know, I used to visit churches and shops and the post office with my mother. And it was all the kind of the bright proposal of a seaside town, colored terraces, kind of rackety things. Later on, we would have spent holidays near Neenah on Lough Derg. And Neenah was a strong medieval town, a bit like Clonmel, although I didn't know it at the time. And holidays were full of visiting shops like this. And, you know, that sense of just coming into a sunlit, straight street of this kind, really almost nothing had changed since Robert French photographed these towns for William Norris. And the idea of these kind of very strong urban entities playing another part to what the landscape outside, the sudden change from landscape to town was really sharp and complete in the Lawrence photographs, and that we've kind of lost a little of that now. Next slide, please. And this is the kind of thing that I've done in the book, which is to put together all the medieval town, or some of the medieval town plans that are of a same type. These are all linear town plans. And, you know, they describe the kind of, how they quickly fall into a sort of an arrangement of type. These are linear ones, there are grid plan ones, and so on. And they really kind of try and identify the significant qualities of the towns, and they reflect the fantastic mathematics of the feudal system that set them up. So if you look at the left-hand plan in the middle row here, that's, I don't know whether you can see the cursor on this, but that is Kilmallock. It's a simple linear plan. And then if you go to the next slide, you can see that is Kilmallock again. That is the same linear plan in a historic map from the 16th century. This is the Jones plan from Trinity College. It's a lot more complex than it appears on my linear plan, but it represents the imagination of the medieval organizing mind about creating a world. So you've got walls, you've got gates, street pattern, burgage plots, church, castle. It's a whole protected world for the insiders. Next slide, please. And this is Clonmel again. This is an aerial view of Clonmel. The more elaborate grid plan of Clonmel is still really evident in the plan you're seeing here. And as everyone at this conference probably knows, the same arrangement of burgage plots, marketplace, parish church, and so on persists over time. Those property boundaries are much the same as they were in the 13th century. So that's worth preserving. And that's what interested me about all of these as an architect. Next slide, please. Could I have the next slide? Yeah, Galway. This is a really beautiful map of Galway drawn in 1583 by Barnaby Gosh. In a way, medieval towns like Clonmel and Galway have come through our difficult history the best because they represent the complexity and layering of the first on the ground. They're also most obviously within the European canon of urbanism. And in our interest in that, I suppose we've disremembered the Normans and their exclusions of the native Irish. But this map of Galway describes the really beautiful formal qualities of that town: walled, gated, grid of streets dividing to go to the port beside St. Nicholas Church, and outside the walls, fore and aft, the shield and breastplate of the two vanished abbeys, conferring blessings, but also they're linking natives and invaders under the one God. Next slide, please. The next slide is Dungarvan. Can we just get the next slide? Thank you very much. This Dungarvan was a port town reserved for the king. It was a tiny bastide on the corner of Waterford. In this aerial view, it has the same pattern of a market street which divides to go to the port. Athenry is similar, and that division of routes often creates a more spacious marketplace where the whole plan inflects to contain animals, vegetables, and people on a particular day. So next slide, please. This is a drawing of Fethard, and this is a redrawing that Tyge O'Keeffe did of a 1708 map. It's one of those really strong trumpet-shaped marketplaces, beautiful and functional. The market house you see in the centre, which is now demolished, would have given huge focus to this space. And one wonders whether in the right hands, a modest building could go back in that position. The large corner building is also gone. That's at the top of the trumpet shape. And that whole edge has been weakened for a road widening scheme. This is the kind of thing I hope more knowledge would avoid in the future, and this is the point of a book like mine. Next slide. This is Thurles. Again, in this aerial shot, Thurles has that same wonderful kind of trumpet-shaped marketplace, same incredible spatial containment. Now, even in the 1950s, cars were beginning to clutter its footprint, but there's no reason why it couldn't now be reimagined to make a space for people here and not cars. Parking can be solved in so many different ways to ensure people can still move around freely, but not at the expense of these great spaces. Now, because this conference is organised by the Walled Towns Network, I thought it'd be good to just read you a quotation from the people of New Ross, and at the same time, maybe the next slide, which is New Ross, the main guard. Because having built this town, this fantastically grid planned town, they needed to wall it. So I quote, "A wall of stone and mortar they would build around the town, for that war was causing them concern. At Candlemas they began. On Monday the vintners would go from daybreak till the stroke of 3. On Sunday the ladies go to heave the stone and carry it out of the fosse, declaring that they will build a gate. When it's complete, not an Irishman in Ireland will be so bold as to dare attack it." End of quote. Now, they were new people in a perilous colony. They'd made a beautiful thing, a whole grid planned town. They were really excited by it, and they wanted to preserve their way of life within it in parallel with what was happening in Europe at the time. But if you look at the next slide, which is the Fade in Wexford, those same medieval towns did exclude those who had been there before, and at best agreed a market space or a fair green, an Irish town, if you will, at the gates. So the Fade in Wexford is a built form of that apartheid, which really continued the duality of conversations about towns in Ireland begun by the Vikings when they first began to fetch up beside towns around the monasteries. So there are so many of these. And if you go to the next slide, these are just some examples that I've just picked out. Ballybricken and Waterford on the left, Wexford in the centre, and then New Ross with the Irish town just in that straight piece going off to the right like a handle. But there's also Clonmel, Kilmallock and so on. All of these developed Irish towns right outside their gate. And that's really important because our complex history, particularly during the plantations, makes us a bit ambivalent to towns and what they represent. This next slide of Roscommon, or at least it's Nicholas Malby's plan of Roscommon, what he intended it to be, the mark of colonisation, the displacement of peoples is really conveyed in this slide. In the savagery of our history, what had to be endured really became shorn and blunted so deeply that when we took control ourselves, myths of the new state were based on De Valera's cosy homesteads rather than on cities and towns with all their perceived social ills. We know the British presence in Ireland really required it to denigrate Irish things to justify wholesale land transfer. And that's been the case since Giraldus Cambrensis. The wild Irish, who needed to be civilised, and later the moral imperative to improve, scarcely concealing the profit motive. Sir Edmund Spenser, for example, wanted to place, and I quote, English inhabitants of all sorts as merchants, artificers and husbandsmen, to whom there should charters and franchises be granted, so would it in a short space turn those parts to greater commodity, and bring ere long to Her Majesty much profit. For those places are so fit for trade and traffic as I have seen ensampled at Maryborough and Philipstown. End of quote. And this all the while, the O'Moores and the O'Connors were being drummed out of their ancestral towns and monasteries so Philipstown could be garrisoned. They left a complex and interesting Gaelic world, which is now slowly being recovered from the shadows. That's a world without formal mapping or many documents or standard measurements, the Ballyboe to the plantation acre. But what makes Ireland so interesting is that there's always two points of view. All conversations are always piquant and interesting from that point. So while plantation towns may have been hammering out military statements on the ground like this, and Roscommon, by the way, wasn't ever completed in this way, Malby only took on the medieval castle and he retuned it to a smart Elizabethan house. But these towns were really ambitious and they were grounded in Renaissance thinking about urban space right across Europe and the New World. Next slide. Just gives you an idea of that. This is Lisburn, which conveys very, very simply axial relationships, centralized grid plans, triangular spaces like this, or diamonds as they're called, making strong places of exchange and meeting in what was otherwise quite a wild landscape. So everybody's familiar with the savagery of the plantations and that cruel transition of populations. And in a way, we haven't recovered from it. The whole country was really a laboratory during this period for English experimentation on their Irish subjects. Next slide. This is Coleraine and the map on the left and the picture of the diamond. Coleraine was really a sort of a template for Derry, and you can see its walls, its ditches, its relationship to the all-important waterfront. The angles here in Coleraine have been skewed to suit the terrain. And I suppose what I think is really important about all the maps and plans that we see is that towns are very much political statements, particularly in Ireland and also in the New World. Like the famous image, the next slide please, of Derry, which you see a walled grid plan, you see the cannon in the centre in the main square, excluding and defending. Bandon in Cork is another strong rival to Derry, and that was the centre of the Earl of Cork's land holdings, uniting two earlier settlements either side of the river, following the plantation of Munster. Next slide, please. This is where I've just compared the three plans. There's Coleraine on the left, there's Derry in the centre, and Bandon on the right. But in fact, there were never really enough transplanted people to totally reimagine the country. So Irish tenants farmed the land, paid the rent, and sometimes even occupied the town streets in their own cabins, maintaining that strange apartheid, that fractured self that maybe the Vikings had started. And as the warlike 17th century was recast into a more enlightened 18th century, it's worthwhile remembering that, because in just the same way that numbers of planters were never sufficient to completely flood the country, the next generation of towns were actually built by ordinary Irish people in a grudging, symbiotic contract of sorts with their landlords. It's a story that's rarely celebrated. They built all the shops and sheds, all the walls that make the containers of space that we now recognise as towns in Ireland, but that's a really proud fact. And these more peaceable times allowed landlords to make their biggest investment, which might not have been houses in the main, they're houses which we remember them for, but actually they're towns, which were occasionally very joined up experiments, underpinned by brilliant ideas to improve agriculture, industries like linen, and of course their own rental income. Next slide, please. Here's just a sample of some of the plans of landlord towns that I've made. These are ones which have a linear plan. They're all different, all adjusted to topography, and they all make beautiful environments. The whole topography that you see is not represented in the maps here, but what I am interested in is the formality of the plans. And a landlord had to set out the lines along which people agreed they would build their houses and pay their rent. And so the walls that they made create the spaces we now value. Here's a couple of slides that just describe plans that go with photos of towns. For example, this is Listowel and Newcastle West, where squares were to be made. So you can see on the right the plans where the buildings create a square, in Listowel's case where there's a church in the middle, and Newcastle West where there isn't. But there's a relationship back to the historic elements of Newcastle West, and that's another huge area of interest for me. And the next slide, please, which shows Rathdowney at the top and Moy at the bottom. And this lovely sense of these containers of space, which are mainly empty, as you can see in the Rathdowney slide. But when you see them full, as they would have been for so many market days, you can just see them as a totally different thing. They become the containers, the animals, the vegetables, the people in the marketplace, just setting in against the landscape, an amazing marketplace to buy and sell and to meet. And so I think that astonishing kind of fullness that you see is what we want to kind of bring back into these towns, this sense of activity, which, you know, I think we're all very familiar with. If we go to Italy or Spain, or when we can go to Italy and Spain now again, you can begin to walk into a town square, and even though it may be empty, it has a proper paving from side to side. It has a solid sense of the materiality of the walls continuing down onto the floor, and it feels like a contained space. It's not full of cars because they've already contained and sorted out the car park. Next slide, please. The Ordnance Survey map of Stratford-on-Slaney here shows the gigantic ambition of one of these enterprising landlords, and this was Stratford, who was Lord Aldborough, who also built the Aldborough House in Dublin. So as formal playthings of a privileged class, the geometric and spatial expression of these towns, of course, was made with fashionable display in mind. But their architectural design ambition was really clear, it was singular, and it was really innovative in European urban design thinking. Stratford-on-Slaney in the Wicklow Hills, its economy was based on linen and cotton, and you see the manufactory just down on the left-hand side of the slide, down at the bottom by the river. There's two formal spaces, an oval and a circus, and then there's a cross-axial street between church and meeting house above the manufactory. Now, when the economy slumped, the town shriveled to a shadow of itself. But if you just the ambition of it, I think, is absolutely extraordinary. If you look at the next slide of Portlaw, it's important to say that not all promoters of new towns were landlords either. Portlaw was a more philanthropic enterprise built by the Quaker Malcolmson family for their mill workers. All life radiated out in streets from the factory gates here. And then the next slide of Mitchelstown. This is an amazing example of a complex set of spaces achieved in 3 dimensions, using the rolling topography of the hills to generate visual cross axes and surprising views. So when you're there, it feels like the Greek city of Priene, but the building out of this remarkable plan actually took several generations of the same family. That's very characteristic of Irish towns. There's a predetermined plan. Its ambition is often trumped by the timing of leases falling in and as money became available. This aerial shot really flattens Mitchelstown a bit too much, but when you're there, you totally appreciate the interlinking spaces, the tilted plane of the market square, the sharp geometry of King's Square, relationships of the 2 churches at right angles across the terrain, and the Catholic church is right on the other side of the valley, on the right-hand side of that aerial view. Next slide. Westport. And this is an amazing picture of Westport, I think, because it really reminds us how tenuous the whole enterprise was and how much of a risk these entrepreneur landlords were taking. If you look at this kind of shaky street of houses heading down the hill to the first of the amazing terraces that were made in Westport, with the hubris of the Earl of Altamont on his column, the paucity of materials, the already broken down nature of it, and this is about 1890, it's a total miracle of survival from here to possibly being the foremost town of the 18th century in Ireland. And it's important to note this town was built on a sugar fortune from Jamaica. So as well as the usual landlord and tenant exploitation, we will at some point have to reckon with the dark shadow of slavery in many of our towns. So in a quick summary, in our towns, the first and most important quality is their form, the space defined by the wall of buildings that creates it. And in Ireland, I think we've lost a sense of our town's value as bright, brilliant public spaces. We don't believe in them enough, and so we suburbanize them. We install car parks, sometimes with a monument trapped in the centre. Their essential qualities aren't recognised or protected, but there is finally, following the pandemic, a possibility for a lot more people to take advantage of these amazing places to live their lives in. So my view is people need to understand the idea of a place. And the next slide, which is the last slide actually, this is from Lahinch. I'm hoping the book might give a context for these great spaces that we have here, for their sustainable use for the 21st century and beyond, so people can live well in them again, so new things can happen which are architecturally appropriate, so the streets can be filled up and upper floors inhabited. It would be amazing to provide the thousands of new homes we need right in the middle of these instant environments, but that needs an understanding of what's important so we can conserve it and add to it innovatively. The house in Lahinch here is several things at once. It's a hotel, it's a bakery, a pub, and a house. It's complex. Potential new approaches to these towns, to occupy the shops as homes, to live in upper floors. It needs fire officers, it needs local authorities, it needs insurance companies and banks to all buy into it. And one thing about boring topics, and I know you don't want to focus on these this morning, the government produces lots of policies and papers to support all I'm saying today. But not enough work is going into clearing the log jams that are created by the same government regulations. The fire officers who run their own fiefdoms, the building regulations which make it very hard to deal with existing buildings because they're not systems, the insurance companies who won't insure anything but the most standard situation, the banks who won't lend to support more flexible ways of occupying buildings, say by dividing up floors into different ownerships, or loft style living, or living in old factories. People do this all over Europe, and why not here? So first we need help for people to see the huge advantages there are to living where space has already been created for communality, for markets, and for simply living, where a structure exists and where they just need to inhabit it. I think a series of pilot projects are needed in every local authority area, helped by central government, say by taking 3 sites in a single town, so you can build up a quorum of change. The local authority architects department needs to be fully invested in this. They need to know who owns every property, what are the impediments to change, and to start trying to change them. Architects are needed with the right kind of training to work on small conservation and intervention projects imaginatively. And that's what we're all trained to do. So that would in turn encourage people to do the same themselves, as they've been doing since the pandemic began. And we realized that remote working actually did work. Thank you.